When working to illustrate the legitimacy of the Scriptures, one of the things that we point to illustrate that the Bible can be trusted and is a document, for lack of a better description, that is trustworthy and valid and has been infallibly proven over a period of time. One of the things that we point to is the fact that the Bible does something that if you were trying to create a pristine view of its message, you would never talk about some of the things the Bible talks about. You would never bring up the issues that are negative or challenging or difficult. I don't know that Paul would ever write this context that was just read for us to Timothy if his goal was to make sure that the message always was just so perfectly pristine and so perfectly in tune that no one would ever want to not be part of the cause of Christ. He speaks on this occasion about two specific individuals, in fact, and he actually names them. He says, Hymenaeus and Philetus, they're cancers. And normally when you're trying to impress people about a group of individuals that you would like for them to come and be part of, I don't know that you would mention the fact that here are two fellows that were among us who are not behaving as they should, and they're leading astray. In fact, he then continues in that narrative to say that within households there are vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor. He just is open and honest about the fact that within the cause of Christ there are going to be those who embrace it honorably and those who use it for advantageous reasons, those that will use it for selfish ambitions, those who will create challenge and difficulty within it. And the Bible doesn't hide that fact. The Bible just tells what is true about the history of God's people, about the plan that God purposed. And sometimes it's valuable for us to maybe go and examine some of these individuals and how it is that God identifies them and said, here's a difficulty, here's a situation, and make sure that we aren't identified in the same fashion. To make sure that you and I don't appear to view and look just like those that are described in these historical records. And so let's notice a couple of these, and further than just Hymenaeus here and Philetus in 2 Timothy 2. Let's jump over into Philippians chapter 4 for a moment. Certainly we need to be cautious about persuading folks away from the purposes of God. But notice here in Paul's account to those in Philippi in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 2. And let me back you up to verse 1. That'll help a little bit. Therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, beloved. The first challenge of the thought is, get your feet planted firmly in Jesus. Well, why? I implore Euodias and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Sometimes the Bible illustrates to us that when there is conflict, it needs to be pointed out that those two individuals need to start getting along with one another. And again, Paul doesn't hide the fact that at Philippi there's apparently a divisiveness, a division among these two individuals, and he challenges them, he implores them, in fact, to get past whatever it is that's causing the problem and resolve it. Here's the point I want us to note from that. When God identifies a situation that needs resolved, His effort isn't to try to sweep it away as if it doesn't exist. Paul's effort here is not to try to get around or not bring up, that might have been the easier path, right? Maybe the easier path is just we don't talk about Euodias and Syntyche, right? Maybe the easier path would be we just kind of let those guys go on their own. We don't bother them too much. If we try to just kind of make sure that stays off in the distance. But Paul's not like that. Paul recognized and identified an issue, a problem, and he said these guys need to start getting along. They need to start being of the same mind. He addresses it. Friends, when the Bible identifies a problem that we have, the answer to that is not to ignore it. When the Bible identifies a difficulty, a challenge that the church is dealing with, whether it be individuals or whether it be a teaching, whether it be a doctrine, whatever it might be, the implication is when the historical record of the Scriptures illustrates that the answer to those things is resolve it. These two men needed to fix the problem. And he's imploring them that they do just that. Friends, we need to be willing to be problem solvers. Within the Lord's body, it's too easy sometimes for us to sweep problems on down the road Or it's too easy for us to ignore them. It's too easy for us to just act like they don't exist. But what happens? You know what happens when you do that, right? Because you've seen what happens. That problem just gets bigger and more challenging and more troublesome and entrenches itself even deeper and deeper and deeper. And the next thing you know, you've got a firestorm on your hands that was just a small flame at one point. When the Bible identifies us, when the Bible identifies a challenge, a difficulty, then let's resolve it. And let's do our best. And even if it's personal, even if it means that I personally need to work through some things and make sure that I'm doing what is right and striving to be of the same mind with God's people, that I accept that responsibility. Here's a couple of individuals that Paul acknowledges in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Notice two texts, two narratives that we'll look at together in relationship to them. First start in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19. He said, having faith and a good conscience, which some having rejected concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. Some translations say, have made shipwreck. I want you to stop and just think about that for a minute. You talk about something that isn't necessarily pleasant. The Apostle Paul writes to Timothy and says, there are individuals who have absolutely made shipwreck of their faith. And you think about the imagery of that. This isn't a stumble. This isn't a mistake. This isn't just a bump in the road. This is, Paul describes as shipwreck. It's devastating. What's happening to the faith of some. And he says in verse 20 then, of whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I delivered to Satan that they may learn not to blaspheme. He identifies a problem. He identifies the culprits. And he identifies the reaction that should be made of those who are creating these kinds of difficulties. And the problem is that Paul recognizes that men like this will not be satisfied in making shipwreck of their own faith. What will they do? They will go about leading others into the same demise and challenge. Again, resolve this, Paul says. I've identified a problem. I've identified even the who is causing the problem. Address this. I know that at times maybe we don't like things to get overly personal, right? We don't like the uncomfortable nature of that. But sometimes the identity of a problem is personal. And sometimes it has to be addressed in that manner. This person, Paul says, is the cause of this. Here is the real issue. And the problem sometimes, friends, that I've seen anecdotally over the years is that good people are the ones that end up getting marred. Good people, those who are striving to be honest and faithful to their Creator, are the ones who become labeled as the difficulty when the real problem lies here with Hymenaeus and Alexander. And when we identify the real source of difficulty and trouble, don't elevate it, but identify it for what it is and the difficulty that's coming. Jump to the second letter, Paul writes, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14. You notice I'm making the determination, I believe. Here these are the same individual. But he says, Alexander the coppersmith, identifies him further, did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. That's pretty stern. The Apostle Paul apparently was so challenged. So much harm must have come by this Alexander the coppersmith, to the point that Paul says his hope is that the Lord will simply recompense what is coming to him. Let justice reign over this circumstance. I believe Paul to be a very compassionate man. I believe Paul being willing to go into areas where others would not even dare to take the gospel shows him to be a courageous man. I believe Paul to be an honest man. And what I'm simply trying to illustrate to you, that this isn't Paul just simply being vindictive. This isn't Paul simply having a mindset of personal vengeance. This is Paul recognizing the difficulties and harm that this individual had created. And he says, this is who he is. This is what he's done. And he needs justice to come forth in hopes to stop the challenges that he's brought. Again, not a pleasant thing. Not something that brings any kind of joy or peace, but a reality. And the Bible doesn't shy away from recording these moments in history, and at times these individuals in history who were challenging the Lord's people in one way or another. Here's another fellow over in Acts chapter 19. Acts chapter 19 and verse 24. These metal workers seem to be having lots of difficulty with preachers who say, quit believing in multiple gods, right? Coppersmiths and silversmiths and people who had been making trinkets and idols to various gods are probably not real thrilled with the fact that these men are coming into their towns and convincing lots of folks that there's only one true God and you don't worship Him through a piece of copper or through a piece of silver that you fashioned. And here's yet another one here in Acts chapter 19 and verse 24. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He's making his lip. You want to stir somebody? Hit them in their wallet, right? People tend to get upset when you hit them in their wallet. And that's where this man is. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. But you stop and think for a minute. It wasn't the trade that was the issue, is it? The trade issue, there's nothing wrong with him being a silversmith. It wasn't about the trade. See, he's twisting. He's twisting where the real problem is. The real problem is the fashioning and making of idols. That's the real problem. You can be a silversmith. You can be a coppersmith. You can be a metal worker. But the issue is they had been making their prosperity over idolatry. That's a problem. But he wants it to imply that somehow they're being challenged because of what they've chosen. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that there are not gods which are made with hands. All the audacity of this man Paul walking from town to town, telling them that there aren't gods, plural, but that there's only one God. You see what challenge and trouble does? It tries to turn the attention away from the truth of the circumstance. He's not willing to acknowledge the problem resides in the fact that his prosperity is idolatry-based. And that should be troublesome. But rather, he would turn the attention and challenge over towards Paul. So not only is this trade, verse 27, of ours in danger of falling into disrepute. Stop and think about that for a minute. We're going to become the disreputable ones. Without any thought to the fact that that was already the case by the fact of their idolatrous approach. But also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised, and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worships. And now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. So the whole city was filled with confusion. Friends, identify the fact that those causing challenge and trouble for the cause of Christ are not simply isolated moments, but they tend to try to create challenges among others as well. And one of the things they can do is if they can get people not to just simply abandon the idea that maybe Paul's right, but if they can simply confuse the issue. Paul isn't about preaching the message of Jesus. Paul isn't about preaching the message of Jehovah. He's about causing trouble for the trades. See how the message flips? Paul's about destroying the idea of our culture and our society and how all of the area that we know of, they all worship the great God. And he's trying to flip the narrative. And if he can cause confusion and challenge, then he's beginning to get a foothold. And he rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. So we're not satisfied to just cause confusion and speak out against Paul, but now anybody connected to him, we're going to bring them out of the circle so that they can no longer preach the message. When Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. And then some of the officials of Asia who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Isn't that exactly what mob mentality is? Mob mentality, by the way, side point for a moment, is not a new problem. Mob mentality has been around for a long time, where you gather a group together, get them all stirred up, and there ain't but a handful of them that even know why they're there. Am I allowed to use the word ain't from the pulpit? I just did, I guess. But that's what happens. This Demetrius has gone just from being disappointed that he's not making as much money as he once did making the trinkets to the goddess Diana, to now he's got a whole mob of people in the theater, and the disciples are telling Paul, you better not go in there, because that's not going to be a pleasant experience if you do. They're begging him not to go. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, verse 33, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, great is Diana of the Ephesians. Who's the real problem here? Some might try to argue that, well, Paul caused all this. If he had just stayed out of there, if he had just refused to take the message originally to the people, if he had just avoided that, he should have known, right? Paul should have known it was going to cause problems for a town that's devoted to the goddess Diana. Surely Paul should have known better than to even take the gospel into that town. He's the reason why right? The real identifier here is Demetrius was the original troublemaker. He's the one who caused this. We've got to be willing to open our eyes and be honest about where did the real source of trouble come from. And sometimes what happens is that the church has to deal with all kinds of conflicts and challenges and major issues that have blown up way over here. You know, we started over here with one guy who's upset about the fact that he can't make the money that he once did. And now all of a sudden we've got a theater filled with people, a venue filled with people shouting for 2 hours, great is the goddess of Diana, all because one guy didn't like the fact that his wallet had been affected by the preaching of the gospel. And friends, we need to be able to get out of the confusion and the high tension of this and get back to really what is the issue. And the issue was the promotion of idolatry. And the issue was there were some who were not favorable to the idea of believing in a one God, Jehovah God. But again, the Bible's willing to record that for us. The Bible doesn't shy away from moments like this, where yes, even the gospel of Christ caused some pretty harsh and difficult moments when there were those who desired to reject it. There's a multitude of lessons out of 3 John. With a man like Diotrephes. We've referenced him before in other lessons. But let me share him again with you in this context. John writes this short 14-verse letter, right? And he says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. You know, stop for a moment, and on your way out tonight, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this. But when John writes, I wrote to the church, I believe he's talking about something other than this letter. This one seems to have gotten through, and his implication is, I have tried to get my message through to you before, but Diotrephes won't let my voice be heard among you. Brother and friend, if an apostle's voice can't be heard among a body of believers, then whose voice can? And apparently in this church, the only voice that mattered was Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. If Diotrephes didn't approve of you, his first phase was to make sure that you knew he doesn't approve of you, and he also disapproved of anybody who likes you. That's the kind of power and influence that he had. And notice John says he's refused me. He's refused other brethren. He's forbid those who want to embrace these other brethren, and wishes to put them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Can you imagine trying to exist in that environment? Where the voice of Diotrephes is the only voice allowed to be heard? And where he's picking and choosing who's a brother and who's not a brother, and who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in? You know, there's a twofold responsibility the Lord's church has. On one side, certainly there's a responsibility to keep the Lord's church pure, right? And you couldn't allow for men like Hymenaeus and Alexander and others who are influencing the church to continue to do that. On the other hand, you might also have a problem where there's an individual who's rejecting those who should be embraced. Who's telling, and he's the sole determiner of that. That's the greater challenge here, by the way, is that he's the sole determiner of that. He's the only one that gets to decide whether somebody belongs to God or not. I can only imagine the criteria, right? If he's already self-imposed the idea that he's the sole arbiter of those decisions, then I imagine he's probably got his own standard by which he decides that. Otherwise, he would let John come in and educate them about who's a brother and who's not a brother, who should be received and who shouldn't be received. And we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful, number one, to not become Diotrephes. That's what he said. Don't imitate this. This is not good behavior. Don't imitate his behavior. And so we have to be warned in ourselves to make sure we don't start imitating those same behaviors. And also, we have to be willing to deal with them. In fact, John's pretty clear, isn't it? Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. He says, when I get there, I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to address, when I get there, if I get there, I'm going to address this challenge. I'm going to identify it. And we're going to work to resolve it. History records for us within Scripture. It's not pleasant. If I was trying to paint a pristine picture of the Lord's church, even in the first generation, I don't suppose that I would tell you about a church that had a guy like Diotrephes. But the Bible doesn't hide facts. The Bible doesn't shy away from truths. The Bible doesn't shy away from the reality of the challenges that individuals like Diotrephes and Demetrius and these others caused to the Lord's people. If I was going to try to tell a pristine account of the sacrifice of Jesus, I might not tell you that one of his own was the greatest betrayer of all. I might try to find a different narrative, maybe just kind of skip over the fact that Judas was involved in this, that one of Jesus' chosen men was involved in the destruction that ultimately came to him. In Matthew chapter 10, you remind yourself of the accounts concerning him. In Matthew 10, verse 4, we see his selection, Simon the Canaanite and Judas Iscariot. And I believe, and I'd have to go back and look, but to remind myself, but I believe that all but one or maybe two accounts when Judas' name is referenced, it is always qualified by something like who betrayed him. He becomes synonymous as the betrayer of Jesus in the records that reveal about him. But that's who Judas became. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 19. Mark chapter 3 and verse 19. And Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Again, I think if I was going to try to write a book that influenced people about a perfect kind of scenario and a perfect historical record, I don't know that I tell them about Judas. I might want to try to escape the consequences of having to acknowledge that we're part of a body of faith were part of a commitment to and believers in Jesus, who even had one of His own who was willing to betray Him. I don't know that I would tell the accounts concerning men like Judas. I don't know whether I would record failures of the gospel. Right? If I was trying to create a pristine image of the cause of Christ, I don't know that I'd tell you about men like Felix. Maybe I would just write a book or have inspired a book that showed nothing but successes, right? Nothing but the great things that happened in the cause of Christ. Nothing but everyone who was embracing it. Surely a message that says, it shows forth the idea that everyone wants to be a Christian. Everybody wants to embrace the message of Jesus. Surely that would sound better, wouldn't it? To show a history of nothing but just one success after another. But the Bible doesn't do that. It notes men like Felix. Acts 24, verse 24. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." The Acts of the Apostles, by the way, we could start flipping through them, right, and show success after success. We could go to Acts 10 and show the success of Cornelius. We could go to passages like Acts 22 and show how even a challenging man like Saul of Tarsus is converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We could talk about the Philippian jailer. We could talk about so many characters and individuals where the Bible talks about how successful the gospel was in converting and bringing them to Jesus. But the Bible doesn't hide from us the fact that some folks didn't embrace it the same way. Some folks wanted a more convenient season. Some wanted another opportunity. Some, like King Agrippa, were not fully persuaded and convinced of the message. Paul asked him, "Do you believe the prophets?" and then answers the question for him, "I know that you do believe." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." If I was going to write a pristine book, if I was going to write a pristine history of the cause of Christ, I think I'd leave men like Felix and Agrippa out of that narrative. I wouldn't want anybody thinking that there were people who weren't completely persuaded about the message. I wouldn't want anybody thinking that people could actually turn away and say, another time. We'll think about this again sometime. But the Bible speaks truth. It tells what was great and the successes and the things that were wonderful about the cause of Christ that happened. And it also is willing to tell us the stories of men like Felix and Agrippa. It tells us the weakness of a leader by the name of Pilate, who was willing to give in to a mob mentality of those shouting, "Crucify Him, crucify Him." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." I think maybe if I was going to create a pristine story, I would just tell about all the leaders and that became believers and did the right things and responded in favorable ways. But the biblical record, the biblical history records for us all of these scenarios. All of these challenging moments. Whether it be those who were persuading people away and making shipwreck of the faith, whether it be men like Pilate or just don't have any courage and want to just try to wash their hands of the whole thing, whether it be men like Felix who'd rather have a better time to think about these matters, or Agrippa who's just not really all that convinced yet, the Bible simply tells the story. The historical record of what really happened. And how some men and some women embraced its message and others rejected it. Some embraced it and lived by it from a pure heart. Others used it to take advantage of other people. Some embraced it and lived every ounce of what Jesus desires from His citizens. Others work like cancers to try to create challenges and difficulties. And the Bible just says this is the way it was. It helps illustrate to us this is a genuine historical record. Some try to argue, and here's kind of the backdoor lesson of this message, is there are some who would try to argue against the validity of the historical record of the Scriptures. There are those who would try to argue against the idea that this message bears the genuineness of historical documents. But friends, it has every mark of a pure historical document. And one of those things that it identifies the legitimacy of this message is that it hides no part. If it was trying to simply portray itself as this perfect scenario that always worked for every person that ever came across it, it would be reading or would read so vastly different. And so as the Bible identifies those who didn't live up to its standard, those who failed in connection to the cause of Christ, then my obligation is to learn from these moments and avoid. The Bible has given us these historical records so that we can identify the kinds of difficulties and problems that can occur so that we can avoid them and that we can address them when we see them. John spoke of Diotrephes and the problems he was causing that church. But notice in verse 12, Demetrius has a good testimony, different one by the way, I believe, from all and from the truth itself. And we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. Paul says, here's a bad example. Don't learn from that. Here's a good man. Who are you going to look to? Who is it that you're going to identify what's in front of you and recognize the realities of what Diotrephes is doing to the body of Christ, and look at a man like Demetrius and see the good that he's doing and choose your example wisely. I can avoid the challenges that these men created by learning something from them and how it is that we should react and respond to those. Look at Ephesians 6, verse 21. Paul, as he's concluding this letter, says, "But that you also may know my affairs and how I am doing, Tychicus, a beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will make all things known to you." Paul says here, men, at times that you need to be marking and identifying and recognizing the destruction they're bringing. And just like John, Paul also says, here's a man that you ought to be listening to. When Tychicus arrives, he's going to give you some testimony about the work and function that we've been performing. Listen to him. What the Bible reveals to us is, friends, you and I will never be able to escape. We'll never be able to escape the fact that there are going to be some things, some individuals, some teachings that we have to identify as being erroneous. We have to identify them as being destructive to the cause of Christ and then look for better examples. Look for something superior to those things that are true. One last text, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 15. I urge you, brethren, you know the household of Stephanas, and that it is the first fruits of Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the ministry of the saints. Sure, there may be some problems, some challenges. Paul spoke in this very same letter here in 1 Corinthians about some pretty difficult challenges going on in Corinth. Read chapter 5. Read chapter 7. Read some of the challenges and distresses that are happening there at Corinth that Paul addresses. But as he again begins to wrap up this letter, he begins to identify. You've got some good examples that are available to you. And so look to these men, that you also submit to such, and to everyone who works and labors with us. I'm glad about the coming of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaeus. For what was lacking on your part, they supplied. For they refreshed my spirit and yours. Therefore acknowledge such men. At times we're going to have the courage to uplift the names of those who are honoring God in order to be able to identify those who may be causing difficulties and harms to the cause of Christ And you say, friend, these are men who are striving to honor the Lord. Working diligently in His cause. That's exactly what Paul does. He said in verse 19, the churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house. All the brethren greet you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. The Bible tells us both sides. The Bible will, in its historical record, tell us about men who caused challenge and harm and difficulty to the cause of Christ. It'll then turn around and tell us about men who upheld the truth and did that which was right, and that they should look for that example. And I don't think that changes. We have to do the same thing. At times we're going to have to identify things that are contrary to the cause of Christ, things that are causing challenge and harm and difficulty to the cause. And at times that means we might even have to identify the individual who's causing those difficulties. And be willing to admit this is where the real problem is. Not sweep it down the road, not hope it goes away, but identify it and resolve it and address it. And hopefully, like Euodias and Syntyche, that we try to encourage those individuals to actually improve and work towards betterment. But along the path, we also need to take the time to encourage and uphold the righteous hands and those who are serving and striving to honor the cause of Christ. And identify and encourage those individuals for the good they're doing. 2 lessons in one tonight. One is learn from these historical examples. And the other is appreciate the fact that when the Bible is willing to tell us the good and the bad, during the initial purposes of proclaiming the cause of Christ, it helps us appreciate this is truth. It doesn't hide anything. It peels back any kind of attempt to try to make itself look different than its realities. It's an accurate document. It's an accurate historical document that doesn't hide anything. And the good and the bad that happened as it was being written. And that helps us appreciate the validity. One of many things that helps us appreciate the validity of this book. You may be subject to the gospel in some way tonight. You're going to have good and bad examples around you, right? There are going to be folks who distract you away from what's right and those who encourage you to walk in the paths of Christ. Choose wisely who it is we're influenced by. Choose wisely who it is that we listen to, who it is that we say that's a problem, and who it is that we elevate. They say there's a good example for which I should follow. But ultimately recognize my accountability is to God, not to men. My accountability is to Christ and the salvation that He offers. If you're subject to that tonight or need to return to Him and we could pray for you, strengthen you spiritually, we'd invite you to consider that soberly. And won't you come while we stand and while we sing.